welcome to the IdeaCast interview series, episode 19. My guest in this interview is the Reverend Anthony Acheson, and we will be discussing his new book, Beyond Denial, Essays on Consciousness, Spiritual Practice, and Social Repair. And Anthony has been an ordained minister since 1977 with the United Church of Christ. And so I ask him questions and seek his insight on a number of cultural issues and spiritual issues, and I really enjoyed this conversation. I hope you do as well, and I would encourage you to pick up his book. I will have all information for his website available down below. So thank you for your time. And I'd like to welcome the Reverend Anthony Acheson to the IdeaCast interview series. I'm really excited about this interview. It's going to be off the cuff, and I know we're going to have a beautiful flow in our conversation. So Anthony, welcome. So glad to have you on board.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much for the invitation. I've enjoyed our prior conversations so far, and
yes,
looking forward to talking more today. Yeah, just as a little background, I've spent most of my life in New England, and currently live in Vermont, which I love greatly. I'm an ordained minister. I grew up originally in the Episcopal Church and went to an Episcopal seminary. And as I was approaching ordination, I ended up getting ordained in a different denomination, which is called the United Church of Christ, which is a liberal and inclusive Protestant denomination. And was ordained in 1977, and since then have served a series of churches, mostly in New England. I retired from active ministry about 6 years ago, and I always had a love of words and writing. I did a lot of writing when I was active in the ministry, partly in preparing sermons, but partly also in writing. I wrote all over a period of about 15 years. I wrote a pretty regular religion page or religion column for various newspapers. And as a result of, and as a consequence of, in some respect, writing those columns, I ended up taking a collection of them and compiling them, also revising them, and putting them together in a book. And that book was published a couple of months ago, and it's called Beyond Denial. The full title is Beyond Denial, Essays on Consciousness, Spiritual Practice, and Social Repair. And so that is a new venture and a new adventure in my life, and now I'm in the process of launching that and doing what I can to create and expand an audience for that.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's about 2/3 of the reason we got together for this conversation is to discuss Beyond Denial, and I am about 2/3 of the way through reading it, and so a couple of takeaways for me in reading the book and thus far is that in the beginning, I felt like you timestamp each of the chapters. There's a date. And so I thought, change a few names and we're basically reading that same narrative today. And I thought, well, that can't be judged necessarily, but is one of my first takeaways in some of the thoughts and ideas that you were presenting as they relate to cultural events and social experience that, it's again, without judgment, what you were addressing seems to be a timeless experience in at least Western narrative. And so I found that interesting. And also in having, again, read the bulk of what you've got in Beyond Denial, I can't help but think that you are a good representation of what Reformed thinking, and you and I had talked about this previously in our phone conversation, what Reformation looks like. So I say that partly as a compliment and flattery, but also as a a good indicator or a signifier of what, if there's people in this audience listening and who are curious, that this book is a really good representation for me anyway of what enlightened and spiritual Christianity looks like. And so I say that to you again as a compliment, and my takeaway personally from what I've read so far. And you can respond to that, but that is powerful, I think, and it's something that's important to me is people being able to have options and see their spirituality through a traditional lens and through what religion is. So, there are many people who are willing to give up on religion and religiosity, et cetera. But I think with folks like you doing good work, I think there's a good argument to be had to preserve the institution. So I'll give you that time to unpack that. But those were my initial takeaways in reading your book so far.
Yeah. Well, one of the themes that I write about quite a bit in the book, and one of the themes that means a lot to me just in my life generally, is precisely in the area of what you're talking about, the relationship between what these days is often called spirituality and religion, or religion and spirituality. And as you are probably aware, is that there's a whole category of people who either refer to themselves as spiritual but not religious, or who are referred to as people who are spiritual but not religious. When it comes to that phrase, I do tilt strongly on the spiritual side more than the religious side, by which I mean that ultimately I think that spiritual experience is ultimately more important than religious formality or religious affiliation or religious doctrine. But having said that, I think that religions or religious traditions, specific religious or spiritual traditions, have their place. I think that if and when religion is done in a healthy way, which it can be, and I think that there are instances of where religion is practiced and presented and offered in a healthy way. So if religion is done in a healthy way, I believe that religious traditions and institutions can be a helpful vehicle for a legitimate spiritual experience. Obviously, there are many instances where religion is not done in a healthy way, but I think it needs to be noted that that's true of every field of life. I mean, there are ways, well, as I think we're all aware, there are ways in which political involvement can be done in either an unhealthy way or a healthy way. There's a way in which science can be done in a healthy way or an unhealthy way, and so forth. So I'm very interested in that interface. I do believe that religions can play a positive role. I mean, I'm involved in the Christian tradition. I identify as a Christian. I also practice Buddhist meditation and value Buddhism very highly. I mean, I actually consider myself a Buddhist Christian. So there's kind of a hybrid element there. But I'm very interested, yes, in that interrelationship between spirituality and religion, and finding a healthy balance between those two things.
Right. It's funny you said a Buddhist Christian, because I described you to somebody the other day. We were talking about my next interview, and I said, he's kind of like a Buddhist Christian, he's a very enlightened Christian. So it's great that you say that. You also remind me a bit of, only in spirit, I guess, of Thomas Merton, who was a Trappist. He was a Oxford dropout, and then he became a Trappist monk. And I don't say that in a negative way. He just was disillusioned with that life. And he, I think he had attended a church service at St. Patrick's in New York and just had this epiphany. And he went into the monk's life. And then later, I think he had another epiphany when he was in Kentucky at a Trappist monastery. And he realized he was cloistered and he was not accessible. And he had gained some popularity by way of a book. And I'm sorry if I'm reading off something that that's common knowledge. But anyway, I'm trying to do that for the viewers. He became this very universal man, and he unfortunately he perished, I think, in '68 at a multi faith conference in Thailand. But he just had this extraordinary story of finding faith and then finding a universal faith and a broad faith. And what a beautiful phenomena. So I could almost say it's a Merton, Thomas Merton. You remind me of that to a degree, in that when you identify as a Christian, that's not necessarily a confining statement, that Christianity can be expansive. And in your life as a minister, I would be curious to ask, this openness that you have, has that been well received, or were there moments here and there where people would question that and want to know how you position yourself that way, and are you in alignment or in integrity with again what is more doctrinal and perhaps even more dogmatic? Has that ever I know you were in UCC, right, the Church of Christ, and so probably not so much there, but I imagine has that come up for you? Or
well, in some places it has. It's varied from congregation to congregation. There were 2 churches that I've served that weren't tremendously good fits for me, that were more conservative than I am. When I say conservative, I don't mean in this case in an evangelical fundamentalist way, but more in these 2 churches were more traditionalist, you might say, where my interests in Eastern concepts and practices were not fully well received. I've never, in positions that I've held in churches, I've never been given a hugely hard time about that, but the degree of receptivity has varied. I was really fortunate in that I came to a church in the town that I am still in, that I'm speaking to you from right now, which is Greensboro, Vermont, in the northeast corner of the state. And I came here in 1999 to serve the church here. And I loved it, and I was very wonderfully, warmly received here. And for that reason, spent the last nearly 17 years of my ministry preaching here and working here. And in this particular congregation, these views were very warmly received. So it's varied from place to place, but the churches that I have been in have all been in a relatively inclusive denomination. So it hasn't been as great a problem as it might be for somebody in a much, much more conservative tradition than I'm in.
Okay. And in terms of, and I'll probably keep pulling us back to this, in terms of people reforming, if you will, that almost seems like that there will always be that sort of alignment and attraction to a narrative. So if there are congregates that or membership that does lean into more of a cultural conservative stance, it seems like that there's less opportunity for a change or a shift. And I've wrestled with that. I wonder, because sometimes I wonder about congregations changing and then having the hierarchy reflect that, or the minister reflect that, or whomever they're working with. And so what are your thoughts on how Christianity as a whole, and or at least whatever you want to work with, are there inroads that can be made in that regard? Or is it more that cultural beliefs and narratives for the individual are pretty much so imbued in that individual that, it's probably always going to be the case that people align to, what's being said and what's being offered by folks like yourself? ministering.
Yeah.
If that makes sense, if that question makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. And boy, I think the question you're asking is really, really important, crucially important. It obviously, it varies greatly from person to person and also from congregation to congregation, or at whatever level we want to look at. But where I would start in response to that question is to be aware that religious traditions over the centuries and over the last several thousand years have continually been in the process of change. And there are many, many instances of that. I mean, I think, for example, of how in the Judaism that was practiced, say, 2,500 years ago or 3,000 years ago, for a long, long time, there was a practice of bringing animals into the temple and killing them, slaughtering them, and then offering them as sacrifices. I mean, I think that the idea was that this was a way of offering a sacrifice to God. There was also an element of how there was what we now would fairly easily be able to see as kind of magical thinking, where people were thinking, well, God is angry at us and wants to punish us, so let's put the punishment on these sheep and goats instead. It seems laughable now, but that was a reflection. And I'm not saying this to be critical of Judaism. I'm just saying that because I consider I'm in the Judeo-Christian tradition, but that was an example of where that practice was believed in for a long time, but then eventually they let it go. And by the time of Jesus and by the time of early Christianity, Judaism had largely let go of practices like that, or was in the process of letting go of practices like that. So that's one example. And then another example that I would cite that I feel is especially important is that Jesus himself embraced certain aspects of his birth tradition, his Jewish birth tradition, and very importantly, he also said no to certain aspects of his birth tradition. And one notable example of that is he is reported to have summed up the law as having two main elements. One is to love God fully, and the other being to love your neighbor as yourself. Now, not everybody knows that those two aspects of his summation of the law are both direct quotations from the Jewish Bible. The loving God with your whole being is from Deuteronomy. And then that phrase, love your neighbor as yourself, is from the book of Leviticus. So he took one of his main teachings, love your neighbor as yourself, from the book of Leviticus. But Leviticus also teaches that if somebody harms you, you take an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And Jesus, in his teachings, also rejected the eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth teaching in the Sermon on the Mount. So that's an example of where he took one teaching from Leviticus and said, yes, this is central and should be kept. And he took another teaching from Leviticus and said, no, this is something that must be let go of. And so to me, Jesus is a great model of a person who both said yes and no to parts of his own religious birth tradition. And so that to me is an example that, and I guess one of the things that I like to say about Jesus, and by the way, Jesus of Nazareth is a figure that I revere and feel is a voice that the human race really needs to take advantage of and benefit from. But he was a person who part of his value is not just in the specific teachings that he made, but also in that model of engaging in the process of reforming his own religious tradition by saying yes to part of it, but also by saying no to part of it. And I believe that in every age, in every generation, that's part of what we need to be doing, is looking at the traditions that we may be involved in, and sifting out what needs to be kept and what needs to be let go of.
Yeah, and it seems that with Jesus' reformation, that the narrative of the God of Abraham was refined quite a bit. So, in other words, the God of the Torah and some of the behavior and so forth could, had some issues there, and he was sort of a grumpy, kind of back and forth God that needed to be pleased through sacrifice and all these different things, and it seems that the intercession of Christ kind of tamed that down and tempered it down to a more accessible and enlightened narrative of God, of the idea of God, and so that's just probably my own self-centric way of interpreting Christ's offering and teaching and wisdom, is that there's the practical shifts that, like you said, there's don't necessarily take this so heavily, but it's just your fear of God and your interpretation of God after he came on the scene and helped to lay down more egalitarian thinking and loving thinking and compassion and all these beautiful things that he was that he brought forward.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
And the change then shifted. So going back to reaching out to more traditional adherents, I could be naive, but I almost think that you could maintain your personal traditional or conservative views, but also embrace that nature of compassion and empathy and care and not so much of the fear that was more prevalent in the Old Testament or in the Torah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So maybe that's one route, is to really do some self-examination, and because again, there's nothing wrong with you yourself being a traditional person. I mean, I think if people were looking at how I live, I would be considered a very traditional and conservative person, but not in my mind, but the way I behave, so there's a dichotomy there, but anyway.
And I would just say that, and this is maybe a shorter way of saying what I was touching on before, but it's possible to be traditional in some respects and non-traditional in other respects, and to be in process and in flux about which elements of a tradition again we embrace and which ones we may choose to move beyond.
Absolutely. In light of what we've just talked about, let's look also at the Buddha nature of your Christianity. And in your book, you talk a lot about ways to think of God beyond the Sky Father and the paternal character. And so I'd like to explore that with you, to think of God in other ways. As mystery, as consciousness, as co-creative, co-experiential force, or however you want to address that. But let's look at the obverse, and we'll go back and forth. But I in having read your book, that was very inspiring to me to get your perspective on that, and it aligns with how I tend to want to think of the mystery. So if you would like to elaborate on that.
Yeah. Well,
there's a lot there, but sorry.
Well, yeah, there are a lot of different ways we could go with that. You just used the word mystery, and what popped into my mind immediately, this is not in the book, but what popped into my mind immediately is there's a singer-songwriter that I really love. Her name is Iris Dement.
Oh, yeah.
And so she has a wonderful song. I don't know if you've ever heard this song, but she has a wonderful song called Let the Mystery Be. And it's a song that is from fairly early in her career. And there are several really wonderful videos of it on YouTube. But one of the sections of that song is, I won't be able to remember the exact words, but the gist of it is, some people think this happens after we die, and some people think that happens after we die. But as for me, I just like to let the mystery be. And I think that I think that there's an aspect of the spiritual life that has to do with letting the mystery be. And I think that one of the things that religion, traditional versions of religion, sometimes tend toward is wanting to offer people a package of beliefs that they can feel absolutely certain about.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a very different view of that. And my view is that what in many traditions is referred to as faith, what in my, and including in my own primary Christian tradition is referred to as faith, often has to do with accepting uncertainty, accepting that there are some things that we can't fully know. So I think that applies in several areas, but I think it applies specifically in the area that you're raising right now, which is what is this thing? What is this reality that we often refer to as God, and sometimes we refer to in other ways? And I think ultimately, I think there's a lot of value in thinking about that question. I think there's a lot of value in reflecting on it. I think there's a lot of value in using different terminology for that ultimate reality. But at the same time, I think it's also really important to realize that the full nature of reality itself at its deepest depths is something that our human cognitive mind cannot fully grasp.
Mm-hmm.
And that brings us into the realm of something that we experience as mystery.
Mm-hmm.
I think we can get glimpses into it, but we can't grasp it fully with our minds. And so to me, it's important to be willing to let mystery be. And even as we continue to talk about and think about the nature of things.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the most trajectory shifting bits of history and characters of history that's impacted me in the last, say, 2 or 3 years was, and it's branches out, but the Sextus Empiricus and his idea of epoche leads to ataraxia, which is kind of fancy Greek stuff, but it's basically that suspension of judgment leads to this sort of sense of well-being, and I love that. And he co-opted that from Ajnana skepticism in India, and that was tied into Advaita Vedanta and Brahman and all that. But there was a lot of exchange going on between the Hellenistic and Indian cultures. But I just love that you can suspend. You can speculate in a healthy way, and you, as you said, we can be informed by hints and teases of things, but to just ultimately have that sense of epoche and suspension of judgment, to me, is more fulfilling and gratifying than trying to narrow things down as truths, because I think we can seek truth in things probably more earthly in nature, but to seek truth in the ineffable and the as science or sciencey people would say, the unfalsifiable. It's almost an exercise in futility, and I don't dismiss spirituality for that sake, which some of them do, and I think they go way too far in that. And we can open that up too if you want to address sort of neo-atheism and denialism and all that kind of thing. I'd like to see if you're interested in talking about that. But for me personally, and what I would try to pass to others is just, as we were saying, let the mystery be, and be comfortable as an experiential agent, just exploring, that which you can wrap your hands around.
Yeah.
If there's anything of interest to you with regard to skepticism or any of that kind of thing, I mean, I like skepticism, but sometimes I think people get carried away to the point where it's injurious to your fellow humans when you kind of dismissively look down on people who are people of faith. I find that rather offensive, and so I could start with that and hand it off to you.
Yeah, and it works in both directions.
Right.
I mean, there there obviously are people in very traditional forms of religion that look down on non-believers,
Yeah.
and then it can work in the opposite direction as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
But you know, just the word skepticism in English has a somewhat pejorative set of associations with it. In Greek philosophy, skepticism. I'm not an expert about the Greek philosophy, but my reading of what the school of skepticism is in Greek philosophy is that it had to do. My interpretation would be is that it had to do with constantly keeping ourselves in an open position to new information, new knowledge, new insights. So skepticism, it sounds like, while I'm skeptical of that, I'm negative about it. But to me, it's more a way of saying, well, here's how things look to me now, but I don't want to just totally buy into it. I want to remain open to new experience or new information. So to me, that's a more positive way of framing out what I think this maybe some of that Greek approach to skepticism was about.
Yes, I would agree. I think if you distilled it down, they would say knowledge is impossible, and they don't mean that in a way that is, you know, like it's all futile. But I think they just wanted to have that position so that then, you know, we could bring in arguments against that, and then maybe help suss out a truth claim or something, you know, to anchor a little more deeply. But and I don't go that far myself. I think knowledge is possible, and I think, you know, we can as there's I think it's Robert Lawrence Kuhn on YouTube here, and he has Closer to the Truth is his series, and he's always talking to different people on multiple camps and multiple perspectives, and I like that. Closer to the truth is what you aspire to, rather than a truth.
I love that. I love that phrase, and I'm gonna look up that site to see what that person has to say.
Yeah, he's a neat guy, and he gets in all the different camps. So he'll talk to theologians, he'll talk to scientists, he'll talk to atheists, he'll talk to people who are spiritually inclined, and so he's just asking sort of very core questions and some utilitarian questions about, you know, the functionality of being and life, et cetera. But it's an interesting series, but I like that it's a guarded form of inquiry, or it's a healthy form of inquiry. And the other term I like is ethical skepticism, that you can practice inquiry, but at the same time, you're practicing epoche, which is to say, well, I'm going at this inquiry without a what do they call it, confirmation bias or whatever, and that you can be open-minded. And so that's why I kind of threw out that certain folks get a little bit activist and a little bit carried away when it comes to saying, well, you know, we've discovered everything through physics, and, you know, spirituality is a moot point and so forth. And it's like, well, no, it's kind of woven into 10,000 years of human history. And there's something going on there. And it may, again, don't try to find a destination in that. But anyway, that's what makes us unique, right? We're such a diverse species. And
yes, we are. Yes, we are.
And I'd say that's one of the reasons I like the idea of pursuing what Reformation looks like in as it relates to religion, because you know, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are wonderful vehicles and means of finding spirituality. So if there's room for reform in that, you know, I like to think of religion as being like a tool. You can give someone a hammer and they'll go and build something with it, and somebody else will take a hammer and go pummel somebody with it. So I mean, it's not the religion that's, you know, so much the concern. It's how it's the agent that expresses the doctrine or interprets the doctrine. So that's always something that intrigues me, that beyond. So I would consider, I would probably not be the kind of person that would align with a religion. I'm sort of non-affiliated, and in fact, I've got a very strange perspective on it. So that's what I think we should all have is our own unique way of interpreting it, and we can align in camps and so forth. So going to, in your book, Beyond Denial, you cover some cultural and political matters too. And so if you're comfortable, let's address a little bit of that and how religion informs the political phenomena or the political system. And I think a more humane and egalitarian spiritual religion, much like what you've practiced in your life, I'm trying to imagine how that would inform culture and politics. Can we do it from that perspective? Like if folks like yourself were to have more of an influence on a political system, I'm trying to imagine that's kind of makes you think good thoughts, that a humane, empathetic, spiritual religious system informing a political system, and what would that look like?
Yeah, well, I think that one way to approach that question is to think of some historical examples, and there are two that pop into my mind quickly. One is that Martin Luther King was a committed Christian person, and he also happens to have been a Christian minister. And his philosophy of his work as a civil rights leader was very directly influenced by Christian theology and Christian ethics and Christian principles, and specifically his belief in the power of nonviolence as a way to not only do the right thing, but also do an effective thing. And even though obviously the work that he was set about to do is nowhere close to complete, nonetheless, a lot was accomplished during those years of, starting in the late 50s and through the rest of his life. So that's one example. And another example is Gandhi was a very devout Hindu. And he, the work that he did in India, which had a tremendous positive result, first of all, in freeing his nation from English colonialism, and also in making huge progress in moving beyond the caste system, was again based on a person, on the beliefs of a person who was a committed religious person in the Hindu tradition that he grew up in. So those are two examples from history where people who grew up in and believed in and practiced a particular religion were able to bring the principles within those two religions out into society in a way that made a substantial positive difference.
Absolutely, two great examples. And I've been very ignorant of Martin Luther King's theological position, or his what he holds in his heart, or what he held in his heart. And just only in the last couple of years have I taken the time to, and I believe there are some good books out there, and I should go further in my enlightenment, but he was a very universal man. And so he was a man more of the spirit of spiritual insight from his, he was being informed through a spiritual lens, I should say, rather than a doctrinal lens or a scholastic lens or any of that. And I get now more of where he was able to connect, I think, with people in being that sort of transcendent preacher, the one who can connect. And, the 60s were different. And so he connected with African Americans, but as well, he also, I believe, he reached out and he was able to connect with Euro folks like ourselves. And there's a lot to be learned from how he approached his faith, I think, and it transcends color or race or anything like that. I think he's a good example of what we've been working with here in this conversation.
Yeah, and if I could just throw in one other thing along those lines, is that a very significant segment of the abolitionist movement in the United States in the first half of the 1800s, the abolitionist movement was heavily populated by active Christians. I mean, there probably were people in that movement too that were not involved in churches, but many of them were active church people. So that's another example of where religious faith was explicitly used as a tool and an argument in favor of love and social change. So there are several examples along those lines.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh, I just had a thought and it just ran out of my head. It'll catch back up with me in a minute. Can we talk about literal interpretation versus allegory? I think that's what the thought that tried to escape me. And you touch on that in your book in a number of places casually, but I want to maybe bring it out a little stronger and talk about that. So in other words, going back 2,500 years ago up to 2,000 years ago in the time of Christ, humans, and actually up until the Enlightenment, people interpreted things differently. And we take a very, very literal interpretation of things now in the last 200, 250 years. And it's a trade-off. We got science for this, but and science is absolutely critical in our lives. But so the idea of what the way people spoke and taught and the didactics of, what do they call it? The Axial Age, the transition from BCE and CE. Can you speak to that? Can you speak to allegory and how to responsibly understand what the sages of that time were speaking to?
Yeah, I mean, I think that first of all, the concept of the Axial Age is a valid and important one. There was a German philosopher in the middle of the last century called Karl Jaspers, who either created that phrase and concept or at least is associated as a person who expounded on it. And I think you're absolutely right that period, how people define the Axial Age, varies from scholar to scholar, but it was roughly in the period of time between when the Hebrew prophets appeared and the Buddha and Plato and Socrates and Jesus, when there was a shift away from thinking about the world in mythological ways to thinking about the world in more immediately tangible ways. I mean, it's actually easier to describe what they were moving away from, which was the mythological thinking, than to describe what they were moving toward, which was away from the mythological thinking. But yeah, I mean, that during the period in which Jesus lived, I would say that they were still in the mythological age. I mean, the prevailing Greco-Roman culture of the time still took the various mythological stories, of Zeus and Mars and Athena quite literally. My view is that if you look at what Jesus actually said, I think this is also true of some of those other people that I just mentioned, Socrates, Plato, the Buddha, and so forth. But if you look at what Jesus and those other figures were saying, they were not repeating mythological stories. Jesus was not repeating mythological stories. Jesus was not encouraging people to believe either Greco-Roman mythological stories. He also was not encouraging to believe later mythological stories that Christianity developed. He wasn't encouraging people to believe that he was born of a virgin, or that he was the only ever in history incarnation of God, or that God existed in three persons as a trinity. None of those ideas came from Jesus. Mm-hmm. What Jesus was saying was love other people and trust in God, be willing to forgive, be open to healing, those were things that Jesus talked about. None of those are mythological stories. You really have to, I can't think of any place in Jesus's teachings where he said, here's a mythological story, you must believe this. So I see him as a figure who was part of that whole movement of moving people away from the need to believe in mythological narratives. Unfortunately, Christianity reintroduced them in terms of the virgin birth and the Trinity and Jesus being the only begotten Son of God and so forth. To me, that's a reintroduction of mythological thinking. But I think that if you look at what Jesus actually said, it was more, you could call it preceptual teaching. In other words, he was presenting precepts. He was presenting ways of behaving and ways of thinking and ways of feeling and ways of holding our attitudes as being patterns for how to live life. That's what he was presenting. And that's very different from saying, here's a narrative, you should believe this narrative. Mm-hmm. So I see Jesus as being a post-mythological figure. Unfortunately, Christianity re-mythologized many of his teachings. So I don't know, it's a complicated subject. I'm not sure how well I spoke to it right there, but that's at least what I would have as a starting point of how that transition away from mythological thinking and some of those themes of the axial age that you mentioned were manifested in particular in the teachings of Jesus.
And staying with Jesus's teaching for a moment, I know the term Christ consciousness comes up a lot, especially sort of more into the spiritual end of the spectrum and even into New Age circles. And I think unity covers that too as well. Yep. And you speak to consciousness quite a bit in your essays in your book. And can we speculate for a moment with regard, because you've mentioned this in your book, so I feel comfortable bringing this up as we both agree that, you know, we're talking about a universality of consciousness potentially being sort of the grounding of reality. Okay, I'll just be blunt. That's one option on the table, and that's where I tend to hover around. And so the consciousness of Christ and what he brought forward for humanity to be inspired by and learn from, would you say that is perhaps language fails here to say that if there is a greater consciousness, a universality of consciousness that could again then be defined as God, that access to probably higher ideas and higher and I mean, when you really think about it, Christ was covering some real basic things, love, compassion, empathy, and service, and all these things. So I'm not reaching too far out into supernatural kind of perspective here, but so in other words, was Christ just switched on more and had less ego and less filter to really stick to a narrative and not get distracted by being a human with an intellect and a narrative and a self-orientation, like we have, like a more deep self-orientation. But what's your perspective on that? So what was the driving force behind Christ's being able to be that person who can consistently lay down some just, valuable ideas for us to live by?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I would go back quickly to our earlier discussion of mystery. There's some things that we don't fully understand. I don't think that I know why Jesus had the consciousness that he had, other than to say that I think throughout history there have been a series of individuals who have been very perceptive, or very conscious, or very insightful, or have had a very high level of wisdom. I mean, those are all a variety of ways of saying it. And I think that Jesus was clearly one of those figures who had a high level of awareness, or we could also say a high level of consciousness. I personally believe, I mean, we're talking a lot about Jesus right now. I think a lot of the things we're talking about, you could also say about the Buddha and Socrates and so forth. But I obviously I'm in the Christian tradition, so to some degree, and I have lived around the teachings and words of Jesus over the years as a preacher and minister. One of the things that I feel very strongly about in terms of approaching Jesus as a spiritual teacher, which is what I see him as being, is I believe that in some respects, what he was most fundamentally was what I would describe as being a teacher of consciousness. Now, some people, when they hear that, have a hard time relating to that, because some people would say, well, now, wait a minute, I've read the New Testament and I've never seen the word consciousness mentioned even once. But the problem is it's an issue of translation. Right. For one thing, most translations of the Bible, of which there are many, most translations of the New Testament, of which there are many, are, even though they may be different translations from the King James, they're still very, very strongly affected by the language of the King James. And in the King James, the word consciousness, it wasn't used in England in the early 1600s. It wasn't sort of a common part of the language of the time. But think of, I mean, there are many examples that I could point to. One that is occurring to me right in this moment. There's a passage in the Gospel of John where Jesus is reported to say, if you continue, I think the traditional translation is something like, if you continue as my disciples, or if you continue in my word, you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Okay, so that's roughly the traditional translation. When I use that in speaking and teaching, I tend to present it a little differently, and what I would suggest is, and do suggest, is that an alternate way of translating that, which would be equally legitimate, would be to say, if you continue in my teachings, you will become conscious of what is, or you will become more conscious of what most truly is, and that consciousness will set you free. Now, that's a completely valid translation of that text. Now, you could also argue that you will know the truth and the truth will set you free could be a valid translation as well. But we tend to use words like know, which are, for most people, have a very cognitive a set of associations to it. So you will know the truth and the truth will set you free. But to me, that's a teaching about consciousness. You will become consciousness of what actually is. And the consciousness of what actually is something that can set us free. So I think that's an example of, to me, where Jesus was a teacher of consciousness, but our traditional translations don't lead us to think about that, because they're using a different language set.
Right. And
I mean, and there are a bunch of other examples that I could give, but for right now, at least, that is one example I would give of that.
Well, it's a pretty solid example. And then, excuse me, you mentioned the Buddha a moment ago. And so when the Buddha got up from under the Bodhi tree and was more in a being mode than a sort of self mode or having mode, that speaks to what you just said, that he could have essentially said similar things, that, you know, he, in his awakening, he, whatever happened, you know, it shifted him. And so I think that relates to what you just said. It's, in other words, there's parallels there in what the Buddha came away with in his enlightenment or his awakening, and what Christ was relaying consistently, So that kind of raises a question where, you know, did Christ have a Bodhi tree? Did he have a Bodhi tree moment, you know, or was it innate within? And that's what led me to wonder if this person, the Christ, and, you know, there's been embellishment of the narrative, obviously, but it's just, and there doesn't have to be an answer, but, you know, was this person born with this innate sense of that being mode already, and understanding that the self of his being, you know, is what the Buddha talks about being the attachment and the illusion and all these different things. So it's a curious question. It doesn't need an answer. It's just a question to be thought about.
And one thing, your comment triggers another thought, which is that first of all, the word Buddha means, I believe I understand, tell me if I'm wrong, but I believe that in the original Sanskrit or Pali, that means awakened, or it means the awakened one. And I believe that the Bodhi tree was the tree of awakening. And it's really interesting, if I could just use one more example, in the Christian liturgical year, which in Christian practice, the beginning of the Christian year is Advent, which is usually, you know, right after Thanksgiving in our calendar. So Advent is the preparation for Christmas, which is the birth of Jesus and so forth. And if you look at the readings from the New Testament that are read for the beginning of Advent in much of the Christian tradition, they include passages where Jesus is saying, encouraging people to awaken or to be awake or keep alert, you know. Mm-hmm. And there again, those passages, I wish that we would translate them more often. Instead of saying, well, Jesus said, be awake, you could easily say, Jesus said, stay conscious, mm-hmm. or keep aware, or keep your faculties of awareness alert and open. So a lot of the language in Jesus's teachings, if you look at them, are really about what I would call the process of staying conscious or becoming more conscious, even though the translation doesn't, the translations don't run that way. And that is also what the name or the title of the Buddha means: one who had awakened and one who was awake.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Sees reality.
And those are other terms also for consciousness.
Sure. Yeah, my simple, crude analogy is that there is a being and there is a self, and the self is often described as the ego. It's the story we tell ourselves and we present to the world. And sometimes that goes into a persona, and sometimes that goes into, you know, absurdity. But that I think both Christ and the Buddha are beautiful, perfect representations of that being. And when you are simply being, and I think that's what mindfulness is, and when people have these non-dual state experiences, that is being. And so that's beautiful. And you've talked about meditation in your book as well, and explicitly that you get out of your mind temporarily to be in just a silence mode or a being mode, and have a little taste of that, so that you are not a person, you are just simply, which I think, if I were to impose any analog to what a mystery might be, is that simply being is a crude analog of what might potentially be outside of our apparatus of perception and experientiality and all that good stuff. So,
absolutely.
Yeah. So therein lies the wisdom that is somewhat obfuscated by, as you said, reinterpretation, mythologizing, fantasy, and things, or, you know, just different interpretations. And the other thing, and this is very much my personal take, and I'll welcome your feedback on this. When we talk about the salvation narrative of Christ and the Redeemer and sin, so I interpret sin to mean without. I think that's literally what Latin is, what sin means in Latin. And so for me, the redemption and the salvation is to basically get you over your own ignorance, and again point towards that of being less about to go Buddhist for a minute, the wanting mode, the material, the consumer, the lust, and all these different things that, the attachment, I guess, is the right way to say that. But that's what I love to think about salvation and redemption through Christ, is that you are removing the ignorance, which I would call sin, the without. And that if you can pull that veil away and then be more in your humanity as a being and less of a judgmental, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I don't want to put any value on that and lead that idea too much. But so that's what it means to me. And if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, well, the actual word that is most frequently used for sin in the New Testament, as the New Testament, of course, was written in Greek. And not everybody knows that. I'm sure you do, but
no, I didn't. I thought.
Yes, the New Testament, all of the texts of the New Testament that exist, that we have, were all written in Greek.
Okay.
Now, there might have been original manuscripts written very, very close to the time of Jesus that might have been written in Aramaic.
Okay.
But all the existing ones are written in Greek. So the Greek word in the New Testament for sin is hamartia, which means literally missing the mark. And the martia, hamartia, the martia is the root of the English word martial, like martial arts, or martial meaning things military, and ha means not. So the idea was, it was a term that was used in archery a lot. And hamartia was when you shot an arrow and it did not hit the bullseye, it went off on a tangent. So that's where the Greek word for, that's the backstory of the Greek word for sin. Now the English word for sin, the English word sin, is related to the German word sunt, S-U-N-T, which means to be cut or wounded.
Okay.
And we also get the word sunder in English, sunder, or something being split asunder.
Right.
Or in the marriage liturgy, what God has joined together, let no man put asunder, meaning to split apart. So in English, the concept of sin is or the word rather for sin is originally related to the word for being cut or separated or wounded. Think, for example, of the German word that we use in English, where you sneeze and somebody says Gesundheit. Well, the GE in that means having been, and Zund means having been wounded or having gotten sick, basically.
Okay.
And then height is having gotten sick, may you be healthy.
Okay.
Or having had something wound you, may you be healthy. All right, I'm getting long-winded here. But the word sin, basically in English, has to do with some kind of wound or having been broken asunder in some kind of way. Now, interestingly, if I can throw in one more thing, the English word salvation, S-A-L-V, comes from the Latin word to heal. And we get the word salve in English. Right. If you get a little cut on your hand, you put a salve on it, S-A-L-V-E, you know. And so the original Latin word for behind the word, English word salvation, has to do with healing. So anyway, I think that all of those things shed light on what salvation and sin are all about. I have sin be the kinds of things that we do when we've been wounded or when we've been separated from our true selves. Okay. And I have salvation having to do with healing whatever those wounds are that make us go down unhelpful paths.
Right. That makes sense. I'll incorporate that in what I was throwing out there a little while ago, because I think, contrary to what might be the more normative, narrative or dialogue or presentation of sin and redemption in Western, more puritanical perspectives, I mean, we could open up a huge thing there, but I like to look at the lighter side of that and say it's less about you being unworthy and separated from God, and more about just we're fallible. We make mistakes, and we it's evident in everyday behavior. And so don't feel like the axe will fall. If it's not to say you should go out and live the hedonist life or anything like that, but it's just I think a softening of that is good medicine to.
Oh, absolutely. I agree totally with that.
Yeah. Because I mean, there's a psychic injury that occurs when you think about things in that regard, and that you feel that you're unworthy and that God may not like you, or he may not, he may be on the outs, which I think, could be some sort of residual from, like we were saying earlier, the Old Testament. God was very testy in those descriptions, and he could be, almost bipolar in a sense, that he had good days and he had bad days, and he would test people in very strange ways. And anyway, so I'm digressing, but so the softening of that idea of redemption and salvation and all that,
absolutely,
bringing it back a little bit.
Yeah.
So you have this book out. I highly recommend it to people who are there's a variety of reasons why I would suggest this book. And so if you are a person who is in a belief system, and you're at that crossroads and you're not sure, this is a good book to to get you thinking in a broader sense about that experience, that phenomena of religion and spirituality. It's also good, I think, if you may have been sort of a non-affiliated person and you want to reconcile with that megalith of what we call religion. And it's not just Christianity, it's the Abrahamic triad, and it's the Eastern religion, because I know some people, it's sort of a knee-jerk reaction to get away from it. Like if you had a strict religious background in your upbringing, and then you reject it, and then maybe you want to reconcile with it, I think this is a good opportunity for that. And it's just good reading to begin with. It's also a time capsule. Like I said in the very beginning, I think you were writing in the mid to late 90s, and what you were presenting in your essays, it's a lot of it's still going on. It's still relevant, and not that 25 years ago was super, it's only a generation, but that these things we wrestle with and ideas that we have to examine are still on the table and still in front of us. And so I think it's a timeless book, because I don't think, I'm not trying to sound like a pessimist here, but I think we are prone to be very slow in terms of cultural shifts and paradigmatic change, with how we express ourselves. And I think that's confounded by the immediacy of whatever you want to call it, technology and access to greater numbers of people and blah, 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 blah. I could go on a soapbox about the internet and social media, but I think, and I think that's good. I don't know. I think there's an urgency also to help people find meaning and sense that is healthy and ethical, and it's informed ethically both in an oughts way, which religion can help with, like thou ought not, or thou ought, and also in the compassion sense, in the Christ sense, that you are mercy, you are Christ-like in that sense, that you are compassionate. So the book is very informative in that regard. So if any of our viewers, anybody watching with us, it has that power to get you to either ask questions or find resolution. So
thank you.
I'm carrying on here, and I'm being a little long-winded.
Well,
but
I appreciate your very supportive words on that. That's really nice to hear.
Well, I think you, in your writing, you speak to what I'm working with, and so I think we're kindred spirits in that regard. So it's exciting to find someone who's reflecting how I'm feeling and how I want to work with people, and do whatever little bit I can do to help with change making and things like that. So so having published the book, do you have grand plans for the future? What's down the road for you?
Yeah, in recent weeks, I've been putting a lot of focus on launching the book, and I did a reading a couple of weeks ago, and the town that I'm in right now. And I have another one scheduled for a couple of weeks from now, and another one I'm doing in Southern Vermont in October. So there are going to be various ones of those. I also launched my first website a couple of weeks ago. It's the address of the website is anthonyeacheson.com. And for anybody watching this, that website has several excerpts from the book. So if you want to just go and sample those to get a feel for some of the different themes that are touched on in the book, that's available. So, I'm going to continue to, promote the book. I have a person that I'm working with who is helping me with publicity. So that's part of it. But I'm also really aware of, I want to do new writing and fresh writing. And within the next month, I am planning on launching a regular blog that'll appear on my website, and that I'm also hoping to encourage people to subscribe to. And so I am turning my attention to what new writing will be. And to be honest with you, I'm much more energized and turned on by new writing than by promotion.
Okay.
Although promotion needs to happen too.
Yeah.
If you want to have what you produced reach an audience. So I'm going to continue to do some of that, but I'm really turning more now to thinking about how to structure writing a blog. And I guess one of the things that I'm really interested in with that is how to say something in a short space.
Oh, yeah.
And which is no easy thing. And I read a lot of blogs. I look at a lot of blogs, many of which are really, really good.
Mm-hmm.
But many of which also are very long. So I'm really trying to, and I'm experimenting with trying to write things that are say something, but only in a few hundred words rather than a few thousand words.
Right. Yeah. And we live in the age of, and I'm guilty of short attention spans. I'm very guilty of that. But I think to bounce that back to give you feedback is that if what you're writing, the content is gripping and it has relevance to the reader, then I know I would be willing to commit to 6 paragraphs versus a paragraph and a half or 2 or whatever. So yeah, I think you just have to feel it out and feel what your audience is responding to. But I think they will be open, I think, if they're swept up. I know for me, when I tend to read, people can talk about nuts and bolts, but when they get into a story about a person, an anecdote, and they give you a little snippet of somebody's life, I won't put the book down until I finish that little bit. So that's my little guilty pleasure when it comes to reading is I'll read, nuts and bolts, and then all of a sudden they'll talk about, Mary Smith or something. And then it's like, oh yeah, I get caught up and I want to know, because it's relevant to whatever the topic. But so I know you've done workshops and speaking engagements. Would that be something, of course, we have to get, let COVID pass or do whatever it's going to do to where we can sort of renormalize or new normalize. But would speaking engagements be something that you would be interested in and addressing whatever you come up with and what you do have already? And I know as a reverend, you are comfortable with speaking to people.
Yeah, I mean, I have led a bunch of seminars and workshops over the years before COVID, and since I've retired from full-time active work in churches, that was taking the form of primarily of going and speaking at churches on Sunday mornings when ministers were taking vacations or doing other things. So I do some of that, and as COVID hopefully will continue to wind down. Obviously, there are a lot of questions about that here in the fall of 2021, but I definitely look forward to doing more of that, but I don't have any specific ones scheduled right at the moment.
Sure. Well, it's good to know that there's a chance that you'll be able to get out and communicate with folks, because again, I think and this is coming through my self-centric perspective, that you're on point with a lot of things with regard to again, spirituality and finding balance and finding a means of expressing yourself spiritually that is efficient, I guess is maybe a good word to say. For me, I'm reductionist. I want to strip everything down to ridiculous, absurd, levels of reduction. But you're far more elegant, and you have a greater dynamic of content, and so I think that's attractive for people, and so your message, I think, is a good one for the times, and for especially hopefully reaching out to people coming up in life and younger folks that are searching and asking questions right now. I know I'm in my 50s, and I know the generation coming up behind me are approaching spirituality differently, and they are ostensibly, I think, more open to what you're doing and what others are doing in terms of, less dogma, more mystery, more egalitarian perspectives and so forth. So I think there's salience in what you're working with, and others, many others in the world. So it would be valuable, I think, intuitively to have you get out and hopefully have access to audiences and be able to teach and inspire people.
Oh, well, thanks. Thank you for the encouragement for that.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I wish that for myself as well, that I can hopefully get out and talk to people and do things in whatever means I come up with. And when I sit and I use my imagination to what would I want to be doing in 10 years, is I thought about the idea of maybe 2 or 3 times a year putting together workshops of 3 or 4 days and having speakers rotate through and just good, inspiring talk to, again, address meaning making, thriving, sense making, these things that seem to be a challenge or that we're wrestling with right now in finding a means of grounding ourselves, and finding that being mode. I guess if I could tie that in, just finding that sense of stability. So anyway, that's one of my little future forward things that I like to visualize, is that if I have any means at all, I will get people together who can talk to an audience and just do it for a couple of days and just have a nice conference.
That sounds great.
Yeah.
And it's really good.
It's nothing new, nothing original, but I would, that's what I love about this interview series, is I'm developing a stable of people that I could call up or email and see how old I am. I like call. So email people and reach out and say, yeah.
Yes, I do remember actual telephones.
Remember before computer. Yeah, hello. But so anyway, I'm rambling, but that would be something I deeply aspire to, is just have these beautiful conferences, 300-400 people or whatever in the audience, and just have great motivation and great inspiration come out from the speakers. So anyway,
I would encourage you to really let that keep germinating, that idea keep germinating.
Yeah, because I am delusional in some sense, but I don't want to kid myself that I could carry something like that myself. I want to, one of my favorite things I learned as a young person when I was early teens is they were talking about Kennedy and his Camelot. And Kennedy, somebody who I would have trusted as an authority back then, said, Kennedy realized his intellectual limitations. So he circled himself with a brain trust of people. And again, I take that on faith that the guy knew what he was talking about, and you could perhaps vouch for that. But his intent was to surround himself with people who were competent, proficient, knew their particular discipline, and they knew their particular skill or trade. And so that's something that has always inspired me, is that, like, if I may be limited in some regard, I will not delude myself. I will find somebody who can do that with me, work with me in that. And I think that's a good, humble way for people to collaborate and to work. Is, I see your wisdom, I see your authority, and I respect that, and you as well. And so we bring these people on board and let them do good things.
Yes,
turn out good experiences. So, well, we've covered some ground, I'd say.
We have.
And, we've covered your book, and I've got it here with me. So I would recommend, again, those of you who are watching, that you pick up a copy of Beyond Denial. I'm enjoying it, And it's one of those things. It's, again, they're vignettes, they're little essays, and so it's not A to Z. It's, you can hop around. I would say go A to Z. That's what I'm doing, cover to cover. But then just pick it up, and for a 3-minute read or a 4-minute read, you can do one of his essays and just take something away from it for the day or for the hour or whatever. So. And I am seeing success for your book, visioning that for you, and as well anything else that may come from that, as well as having you as a speaker at one of my conferences in 5 to 10 years when I can put those together, organize things like that. So that would be fun.
Well, I'm just very, very appreciative of your interest and support and inviting me to be a part of the interview. And on top of that, it's just been a really fun, enjoyable conversation. So thank you very much for your support.
Oh, well, I thank you. And yes, this was a pleasure. I knew it would be. And so it's been confirmed on the other end that this was a great conversation. And I'm going to continue to enjoy your book and let my wife read it and be inspired by it. So was there anything else you wanted to cover before we say goodbye, or?
Not that I can think of at this point. I mean, okay. As far as just talking with you as an individual, I would love to keep in touch and just on an informal basis, because I enjoy talking with you. And as you've mentioned, I think we do have some pretty major interests in common, especially in the whole area of seeing things in terms of consciousness and developing conscious awareness and so forth, and including a wide range of ways of looking at things. So I value that and would enjoy keeping in touch.
Yes, absolutely. And on that note, if there is something you ever want to have platformed or a vehicle of promotion, then you can jump on a call with me anytime, and we can publish it on YouTube and make that a means for you to get something out, even if it's a 20-minute chat. You're welcome anytime to come back on. But yeah, we'll definitely stay in touch, because like I said, as you just said, we relate on a number of things, and I think it's good to collaborate and stay in touch and talk. So we will, for sure.
Yes, indeed.
All right. Well, Tony, thank you so much for this conversation. I know it will go out in the world and have a life of its own, and so we'll send it off. And wish it well, and hope that people are changed by it, and people are positively impacted by what we've covered here. And for those of you watching, thank you so much for joining us and staying for the duration of the conversation. I love long conversations on YouTube because, as I said earlier, we're an ADD society now. We only have 3 minutes for everything, and so I think the shortest one I've ever done is like 48 minutes, and that was like, whoa, that was a fast one. So. I think that's a good discipline, and you can do it in segments. You can come in and watch 10 minutes, 10 minutes, 10 minutes. That's so anyway. So Tony, thank you again so very much. I appreciate your company in this dialogue, and when I stop record, I'll say goodbye to you after we stop record. And again, thank you everyone who have been watching this interview. And
and thanks to you, Justin, and also to everybody watching as well. Thanks for taking the time.
Yes, absolutely. Take care. All right, I'm going to go ahead and